You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, the Supreme Court has just ruled 9-0 against removing Donald Trump from the ballot in accordance with Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. What was the reasoning behind this?
So the reasoning is that the 14th Amendment, Section 3, says that if you took an oath previously to support the Constitution and you engage in insurrection, you are disqualified. But Section 5 of the 14th Amendment says basically only Congress can make that decision. They can pass legislation that implements the disqualification. So plain and simple, the Supreme Court said the states can't do it, even if somebody is an adjudicated insurrectionist, as Donald Trump is in the courts of Colorado, doesn't matter. Only Congress can pass legislation setting out how it is one goes about disqualifying an insurrectionist, and they haven't done it, so here we are.
Well, help me understand this, because isn't it already clear in the plain text of the Constitution what needs to be done? Like isn't that part already laid out? Why does the court need Congress to tell it how to enforce the Constitution if it's already plain as day?
One thing I can promise you, Brian, is I will not be able to help you understand this. As a trial lawyer for 30 years, my juries would look to me like, Prosecutor Kirshner, can you please explain this? And I would often say, I can't explain the inexplicable because, Brian, as you say, the 14th Amendment couldn't be more clear. If you took an oath of office to support and defend the Constitution and you engage in insurrection, and Donald Trump did, we saw it with our own eyes, and courts and secretaries of state have ruled that he did, you are disqualified.
Right.
So I can't explain how it is. The Supreme Court said, no. There's far more to it than that. Well, there actually shouldn't be. The reason I say there shouldn't be is because the Constitution disqualifies people for other reasons. You're not yet 35 years old. You're not a natural-born citizen. You're not a resident of the United States for 14 years. You have held the office of the presidency twice previously. You're disqualified. And the 14th Amendment, Section 3, speaks in clear, direct, unequivocal language, plain English. Donald Trump is disqualified. So how they can say, no, what we're going to need here is for Congress to get together, put a pin in that, and come up with legislation so all of this can be sorted out and applied consistently, not a state-by-state basis. Now, Brian, I am not all that comforted that the Supreme Court just told us all that this decision, whether to disqualify an insurrectionist from retaking the reins of federal power, we're going to leave it up to folks like Jim Jordan and James Comer and Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene and the other House Republicans to work on legislation and then ultimately to vote that, Donald Trump is an insurrectionist, so he certainly can't be president again. That's especially challenging when Congress is full of insurrectionists. They would be voting against their own interests, both specifically and atmospherically, if they passed legislation implementing the disqualification. This, unfortunately, Brian, I say this with no glee. I don't say it casually. I don't say it cavalierly. We are a failed government in some of the arenas that success matters most. We're not succeeding. We're not capable of succeeding. And I think this unanimous Supreme Court opinion, 9-0. Now, there are some dissents where they call Donald Trump out as being a stone cold insurrectionist, but it was 9-0 on the decision that only Congress can do it, and they have to get to work and pass some legislation to make it a reality, which we all know will not happen. A 9-0 decision means it's the law of the land, right? Whether it's right or wrong doesn't really matter. It's the unanimous law of the land and a unanimous interpretation of the Constitution, and we are stuck with it. There is no appeal from a Supreme Court ruling. Where does that leave us, Brian? We both know where it leaves us. Our viewers know where it leaves us. The rule of law won't save us. The courts won't save us. Congress won't save us. We will save us by getting to the polls in November in numbers too big to rig and too real to steal. We are the only ones who can save us. We did it in 2020. We're going to do it again in November 2024.
Perfectly put. Glenn, to your earlier point about the fact that this is a 9-0 unanimous decision, what was your reaction to seeing that the liberal justices signed on to this?
You know, it makes it clear to me that they all agreed with the constitutional interpretation. And, you know, when you read the Constitution and when you read all of the provisions of the 14th Amendment, I can see their rationale. But when they interpret the Constitution in a way that will sort of clear the path for an adjudicated insurrectionist to retake the reins of federal power, something seems to be off. You know, they could have interpreted the Constitution in other ways, but the reality is when you get 9 justices, you know, left, right, and center, to the extent there are any in the center these days, who all agree that no, this is the best, most appropriate interpretation of the Constitution's disqualification clause and the procedures necessary to disqualify a candidate for federal office, you know, we're stuck with that. And I don't even know that I disagree with the rationale when you read through the opinion and the dissents. I disagree with the result, you know, this sort of blind following of certain words and provisions. If it produces an absurd result, indeed a democracy-ending result, a result that may give the reins of federal power back to an avowed day one dictator, it feels like something's off.
To that point, is the court basically saying that if a 14-year-old came before them and said that I should be allowed to run for president, and without a law on the books, that the Supreme Court would then say, yep, I guess you can run for president. If there's no specific law saying that you can't, you're all good to go. Like, we can't, our hands are tied. We can't do anything about it. We can't enforce the provision of the Constitution that says you have to be 35 years old to run for president.
No, I think it's because the disqualification clause is found in the 14th Amendment, which was an amendment designed to basically prohibit the states from doing certain things. You know, I teach the 14th Amendment to my undergraduate criminal justice students at George Washington University. And the 14th Amendment, what it did was it incorporated a whole bunch of rights in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, like a right to a jury trial, a right to effective assistance of counsel, a right against self-incrimination, a right prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment, etc. And it imported or incorporated all of those prohibitions into the state criminal justice systems. That's just one example. The 14th Amendment was designed to limit some of what the states could do if it ended up violating the federal Constitution. And so they took that rationale that, wait a minute, the 14th Amendment was not bestowing rights on the states for the first time to, for example, disqualify insurrectionists from holding federal office. And they were careful to say they can still disqualify insurrectionists from holding state office, but Congress is going to have to take up the question of if and how to disqualify candidates from federal office. So they had a number of different rationales as to why the 14th Amendment Section 3 was just not the vehicle to give this right over to the states.
So is this basically an admission that as of right now, and until such time as Congress actually passes a law to be able to enforce the 14th Amendment, that the 14th Amendment is basically null and void at the moment? That Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, barring insurrectionists who've held federal office before from running again, or those who've given aid or comfort to those who've engaged in insurrection, that amendment is basically just null and void for the moment.
That section of the 14th Amendment is null and void unless Congress gets off its duff, works together in a cooperative fashion, immediately passes legislation, and then implements it against who? Donald Trump, the leading candidate for the Republican nomination. So I'm going to stick with your formulation that, yes, in the real world, in Washington, D.C., disqualification is dead.
Okay, well, of course, we still have the immunity case that we were looking forward to. Even if, the result of this case is disappointing, I think it is not entirely unsurprising given the composition of this court. But now all eyes turn to the Supreme Court for this immunity case. And again, we have that to look forward to on April 22nd, which yet again was another gift to Donald Trump. So to your earlier point, you and I have spoken about this before, and I think it's worth reiterating because I don't want people to leave this with a sense of hopelessness or despair, but it was never going to be on the courts to swoop in and save us. It was never going to be on lawyers or members of Congress or state parties to swoop in and save us. It has always been our responsibility to figure out how to win this election. And so to Glenn's point before, it's our job to show up as we head toward November and make sure that Donald Trump doesn't win and to not leave all of that responsibility in the hands of lawyers or judges.
Brian, let's leave everybody with a little bit of silver lining lurking behind the big dark orange cloud that is Donald Trump. As you say, the Supreme Court will take up the presidential immunity claim. Donald Trump says he can commit all the crimes he wants against the American people and never be held accountable, never be prosecuted for it. The broad consensus is the Supreme Court will not buy into the president is king argument, and they will reject that claim and return the case to Judge Chutkan so she can put it back on the trial track in D.C. That's his federal prosecution for trying to overturn the 2020 presidential election. Now, we won't believe it until we see that opinion, in our hot little hands. But the overwhelming consensus is that they were going to let Donald Trump stay on the ballots, but they were also going to let the federal government prosecute Donald Trump for his crimes. That will be the next important sort of benchmark as to whether we have any hope of remaining a viable democracy. So today we took a hit, but I don't want people to think this was the end game, the ninth inning, and everybody's heading into the dugout and we're done. We are far from done because we have another important legal opinion coming from the Supreme Court that we believe will fall our way. When I say our way, democracy's way and justice's way. And then, as we will say probably over and over and over again until November 5th, we are going to fix this problem at the polls. We can, and I believe we will.
We'll leave it there. For everybody watching, if you want to follow along with all of these cases that Trump is contending with and that the Supreme Court is dealing with right now, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Today, we're going to talk about the Supreme Court blocking Biden's student loan debt cancellation and what the White House is doing to push back. And I interview Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg about his response to being demonized on Fox, what he thinks about those Republicans who voted no on infrastructure but took the credit anyway, how I-95 got rebuilt in record time, and why the White House is focusing heavily on rural broadband that'll help Republican voters who didn't even vote for Biden. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen, and you're watching No Lie. So one of the rulings handed down by the Supreme Court was a 6-3 decision striking down the White House's student loan debt relief program, which would forgive $10,000 in student loans for those earning less than $125,000 per year and up to $20,000 for Pell Grant recipients. It had been immediately challenged by Republicans in court because it was popular and they couldn't risk Biden getting credit for popular policy, especially not when the focus right now should be on gas stoves and Hunter Biden. And I should note, just for posterity here, that the people who spent the day celebrating this ruling because the federal government isn't there to bail people out are some of the same people who themselves received PPP loans that were then forgiven by the government. Like, listen to some of this grandstanding by Republicans. Republican Mike Flood: the only person responsible to repay a loan is the person who applied for the loan. The Supreme Court made the right decision in finding Biden's student loan bailout unconstitutional. He had $840,000 in PPP loans forgiven. Ralph Norman: you cannot cancel student loans any more than you can cancel a car payment or credit card debt. $306,000 in PPP loans forgiven. Greg Pence: today's Supreme Court decision to block President Biden's student loan giveaway is a major win for American taxpayers and for the Constitution. This student loan bailout would have forced the 87% of American taxpayers who do not hold any federal student loan debt to foot the bill for those who do. $79,000 in PPP loans forgiven. Chuck Edwards complains, got $1.1 million in PPP loans forgiven. Kevin Hern complains, $1.1 million forgiven. Markwayne Mullen complains, $1.4 million forgiven. Mike Kelly complained, had $975,000 forgiven. Vern Buchanan complained, had $2.8 million forgiven. because apparently letting taxpayers forgive hundreds of thousands, if not millions of debt is totally fine, but $10,000 for those who are struggling to get by, we couldn't possibly allow that. Even Biden echoed exactly that point.
I was trying to provide students with $10,000 to $20,000 in relief. By comparison, the average amount forgiven in the PPP, the pandemic loan program, average amount forgiven was $70,000. Now a kid making $60,000, trying to pay back his bills, asking for $10,000 in relief. Come on, the hypocrisy is stunning. You can't help a family making $75,000 a year, but you can help a millionaire and you have your debt forgiven. My plan would not only have been life-changing for millions of Americans, it would have been good for the American economy. Freeing millions of Americans from the crushing burden of student debt. More homes would have been bought, more businesses would have been started, more couples would have had the confidence to start a family. Millions of people would have felt they could get on with their lives. These Republicans blocked all that.
And so as a result, Biden announced a new path to providing student loan debt relief. And I hope even those people who say Biden knew this was legally dubious all along, he knew it would get struck down, he just wanted young people to vote for him in midterms, I hope those people are watching what he's doing right now. So first off, he is reintroducing the forgiveness plan, now using the Higher Education Act as opposed to the HEROES Act, which was the legislation that the first attempt was rooted in. Supporters argue that the Higher Education Act allows the education secretary to, quote, compromise, waive, or release student loans. And as far as paused repayments goes, Biden's also announced a 12-month on-ramp for repayment where even if you miss a payment, you won't be at risk of default and your credit won't be impacted. And look, short of a legislative solution, he is doing everything he can. So maybe disregard the attacks by the only people preventing any actual solution from being passed. And I just want to touch on one more thing here. Republicans are trying to frame this as some huge injustice that Biden would even consider allowing the government to forgive student loans. But in doing so, those people are effectively defending the loan sharks. Like oftentimes, the interest rates on these loans are so high, so predatory, that many people have already completely paid off the principal amount, and yet they're still left with a loan that's even higher than when they first took it out. Like we hear about this all the time. People who take out a $150,000 loan, they've been making their payments every single month for a decade, and suddenly their principal is now at $200,000. This isn't about walking into a restaurant, for example, and refusing to pay your bill at the end of dinner. This is about trying to get by and repaying your loan amount every single month, and yet somehow still plunging deeper and deeper into inescapable debt. And the fact that Republicans are trying to conflate the two is as clear proof as you will ever see that these people do not care about working people. They care about special interests and the ultra-rich who do not need to worry about student loan debt. My take on this is if my tax dollars could go toward helping regular people who just need a break, then by all means, let's help them. For once, let's give a hand to regular people who are trying to get by instead of watching billion-dollar corporations get our money, instead of watching the military-industrial complex get our money, instead of watching the ultra-rich get tax cuts. We never hear a single word of pushback when the top 1% get a handout. No one on the right ever decries socialism then. But God forbid a truck driver, a teacher, a cashier, a cook, a small business owner, a nurse gets a little bit of help. Notice how people making millions of dollars are always trying to convince people making $100,000 a year that the people making $28,000 a year are the real problem. And even if that argument isn't resonant with you, even if your position is that you don't want to pay for someone else, full stop, consider this. Biden's student loan forgiveness plan was intended to benefit 43 million Americans. About 20 million of those borrowers would have had their loans eliminated completely. What do you think would happen to the economy when you suddenly make it accessible to 43 million more people? What do you think happens to small businesses, to restaurants, to travel destinations, to clothing stores, to theaters? What do you think happens when people can inject money into our economy's goods and services instead of pumping it into predatory loan sharks? And then when businesses thrive, what do you think happens to the stock market? What do you think happens to your 401k? Allowing people to participate in the economy helps all of us. This is a prime example of a rising tide lifting all ships. And so just think about this for a moment. These are conservative politicians and operatives who have successfully sued to prevent people from having their loan debt forgiven. This won't impact them in the slightest. They just don't want people struggling to get a break. That's all. That's the conservative movement in a nutshell. Make sure that the less fortunate don't get a break, even if it has zero impact on your own life. The fact is that we've been here before. We constantly sit back and watch as Republicans use the same fake populism to glide their way into power, only to then protect not regular people, but the special interests who are screwing those regular people over. If you're the kind of person who has railed against the elites, only to then applaud a Supreme Court decision screwing over regular people trying to escape the grip of predatory lenders, then no, sorry, you're not against the elites, you are one. Here's a preview of my interview with Pete Buttigieg.
Yeah, it's been remarkable to see a lot of frequently Republican members of Congress, sometimes in the Senate too, who voted no on the infrastructure package, showing up to either criticize when something goes wrong or to celebrate when we are delivering funding to these communities. Just the other day, my department sent funds to a South Carolina community to improve their transit. And there was a member of Congress there who attacked the funding, attacked the bill, attacked the package, but was there to celebrate the funding when it came to her community. And I think that just shows that at the end of the day, this really is good policy. Look, the sign of a bad policy is the people who supported it wind up changing their minds later and running away from it. And by the same token, I think the sign of a good policy is even the people who voted no try to come back and take some credit for it when it's yielding all those benefits in their communities.
To watch the full interview with Pete Buttigieg, click the thumbnail right here on the screen or check out the interviews playlist on my YouTube channel. To listen to the audio version of this podcast, which includes some exclusive content not included in this YouTube video, that link is also on the screen. And of course, to see more of my content, you can click that link on the screen to subscribe.